Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to Ethics Talk. My name is Hope May, and Miranda Dover joins me again. Say hello, Miranda.
Hello.
So last week, Miranda and I and some others who called in began a discussion about self-humiliation, and today's show continues that discussion and adds a little bit to the material. So we will be taking calls in a couple of moments, but before we do that, we're just going to spend about maybe 10 minutes recapping what we did last week. Last week's show was called What We Owe to Ourselves, Duties to Ourselves, and What It Means to Violate Them. And we began by talking about humiliation, and we discussed Evelin Lindner's work on humiliation and looked at some definitions. We saw that humiliation is understood to be, number one, a violation of dignity, and number two, it involves a violation or transgression of expectations, which involve, number three, being lowered. So, Miranda, did you want to add on to that definition or say anything else about the definition that we talked about last week?
Yeah, so I just sort of emphasized, like you have said, the two different parts of the definition, the spatial aspect, which is being lowered or being treated lower than you actually are, and the role expectations and perhaps perceptions play in the process of humiliation.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to go back to that. I hope we get there at the end of this show because the role of perception in humiliation relates to this other piece of humiliation that Dr. Lindner talks about, which she calls unintentional humiliation. And so she makes the claim that not all humiliation is intentional, and it can be the result of a mistake, and I think that connects nicely with this point about perception. So we'll get to that, but just to get us back to where we were last week. Last week I played this short clip. It's about a minute and 20 seconds long, and in the clip, Lindner is talking about the relationship between humiliation and dignity, and we really focused on that last week, but I want to focus on a different not focus, but at least draw attention to a different thing that she says in this clip. So here comes the clip. It's about a minute and 20 seconds.
If we look at it, then there is one very interesting turning point in 1757 that has to do with humiliation, how humiliation is defined, and dignity. In 1757, in the English language, in the encyclopedia, for the first time, to humiliate is defined as to violate the dignity of an individual. It is antisocial. For the first time, before it was pro-social. It was pro-social to humiliate a person into humility. Like the man of the house had the duty to beat his disobedient wife, to teach her respect and humility, respect for the hierarchy. So it was his duty to humiliate. It was pro-social. She should learn humility and respect. And we still have that around the world with Taliban. We have many societies where it's like that. So in 1757, in the English language, we have this shift from pro-social to antisocial. And basically, it is the forerunner of 1948 when we declared, as humanity, we declared that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So 1757 is kind of the first step toward that.
So in that clip, she is drawing a thread between this moment in 1757 when this notion of dignity and humiliation shift to be antisocial, like it's a bad thing. You violate someone's dignity. And I just want to point out the year 1757, and anchoring our discussion has been the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who I consider to be the philosopher of human dignity. And if humiliation is a violation of dignity, I guess he's also can be used to understand humiliation. Kant, the work that we've been focused on is his Metaphysics of Morals, which was published in 1797, so 40 years after this shift in the sense of humiliation that Lindner is talking about. So I just wanted to draw attention to that, and Kant is writing in the late 1700s, Metaphysics of Morals, his work Perpetual Peace, 1795, and Religion Within the Bounds of Reason, 1793. So something is happening in the consciousness around this time in the mid to late 1700s, and you can see that reflected in the work of Immanuel Kant. We noted when we were talking about Kant's philosophy last week that he identifies that there are two different aspects of the person, and this is important because usually when humiliation is discussed, it is defined in a way that involves two people, and what Miranda and I were referring to as A to B humiliation. There seems to be a requirement that two different entities are involved, two different groups, two different persons, and as Miranda says, one treats the other person in a way in which the other is lowered. So insofar as Kant talks about these two different aspects of the human person, that seems to open the door to a discussion about whether one of these aspects can humiliate the other or lower the other. So we mentioned that Kant uses these phrases, the homo phenomenon, which is the person in space and time, the embodied self, if you will, subject to the laws of causality. And then there's the homo noumenon, which is this part of the person which is eternal and connects to the moral law. There's at least two different parts. We'd also mentioned last week that other philosophers like Plato mention three different parts, but it is very common to have a philosophical view where there's multiple parts within a body, some of which should not be dominated by the other. So, Miranda, did you want to say anything about this bit about the two different parts within the person? And this is how we're getting to the topic of self-humiliation.
Yeah, so we have been discussing to prep for the show, and we were trying to figure out, is one of the parts humiliating the other? So would the homo phenomenon be humiliating the homo noumenon? And we were trying to get to the root of that and figure that out. And I had a connection to the Freudian concept of the id, the superego, and the ego, and like those three parts and how they sort of work within each other. And his thought is that the ego, its role is create a balance between these two extremes in the id and the superego, and that all sort of seem to have a connection in my mind.
Yeah, that's really cool. So if you want to, I know that some people tried to call in last week or wanted to call in but could not, and so please do call in. It's 516-387-1449. You can also Skype in if calling on a hard line or otherwise is inconvenient for you. But so yeah, here's the question: Can the homo noumenon humiliate the homo phenomenon, or can appetite humiliate reason? And this was something that one of our callers, Randy, contributed when he called in, and you can listen to this conversation of last week But he basically said, he said that. He said, can both of these parts be humiliated? And so, Miranda, this bit about the Freudian idea, do you think Freud says yes to this question, that there can be humiliation to both parts?
I think there's at least a power struggle. I'm not necessarily sure whether he would say that it would amount to humiliation, but there's this constant battle for control and balance going on between these three parts, and the id is fighting for impulse and to just get your needs met, and very physical and animal, like the part that Kant says is our animal self, and the superego is very societal-based, rules-based, logical, consequence-fearing, and that's more like, it's not the same thing at all, but it's more similar to the moral self, as Kant would say. And so there's this balance and this power struggle, but I'm not sure if it would actually amount to humiliation in Freud's eyes.
Yeah, that was there's a question that we were trying to ask last week, and I don't think we answered it, and we're sort of begging the question or assuming the answer to that question with today's title. And the question was last week, look, if you have this battle within, and one side is conquered, shall we call that humiliation or something else? So that was an open question. I think we agreed last week that there is this thing happening within the self, and certain sides may lose. But it's a question, do we call that humiliation or something else? And last week I mentioned the Greek concept of akrisia, which is translated as weakness of will or lack of power, and the idea is you've set a rule for yourself and you violate it. There's something else that wins. The thing that follows the rule does not win. Shall we call that self-humiliation? So that's still an open question, and if you have a view on that, please call in 516-387-1449. So this is Freud's view, but his view is, and I don't know a lot about Freud, but his view is that there is a thing, given these three parts, that is the right thing to establish harmony or something like this. Is that accurate?
It's not that I feel like the more balanced you are and the more you can get those sides to sort of agree and coexist, the more healthy you are in that way.
So the superego should, it has the authority, if you will, and the power to sort of dictate or help these different sides negotiate or come to a compromise, it's the arbitrator or the mediator type of thing.
Right. So yes, the ego acts as sort of the inner judge or the mediator and sort of tries to balance these sides, because if the superego had its full control, everything one would do would be to be social and it wouldn't take care of your physical needs. And then if the id had full control, it would go after your needs and your desires, and not protect your social standing or your standing in the community. And so it's very polarizing. And the ego's job is to say, okay, yes, I understand that you're hungry, but you can't go rob the store because you're hungry. You need to take your credit card out of your wallet and pay for the food. And so it's sort of like that. It's the balancing of needs to make sure that one doesn't overpower the other.
And so if one does overpower the other and the ego sort of has no voice. Is that an accurate way of describing the situation? The ego has no real voice, and one of these sides takes over. That results in like dysfunction, something like this?
Yeah, exactly.
So the ego is supposed to be the moderator.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so if the ego does not have that role, then do we call that humiliation, or are we more comfortable calling that like imbalance or some sort of personality disorder?
I think it could be all of the three depending on how severe the situation is.
Okay, so it's up for grabs then. And I want to say that also who speaks on this question and whether passion can be humiliated because reason controls it. I think this is something that Randy was suggesting last week. Plato in the Republic discusses different virtues of the soul. And Plato's view is that there are these different forces in the soul and that they each have a very specific role and function. And the function of some of them is to just obey. And so he does say, like, the function of passion, of appetite, is to listen and be controlled by and submit to reason. And Plato identifies this virtue that he calls moderation. And he says, look, the just person and the just city is one in which these lesser parts agree to be ruled by the greater parts. And they don't do it with resentment and so forth. They agree, and he says the soul sings the same song. So there's an agreement. And so, I interpret this as like really being inconsistent with the view that any sort of humiliation by the passionate part is a correct response, because Plato's going to say something like that if passion feels humiliated because this other part conquered it or controlled it, passion doesn't really understand its place. It doesn't understand its role, and it has a kind of personality disorder. It's confused about what its role is in the human soul. And I think that Plato, he doesn't talk about humiliation, but I think that maybe it makes more sense to talk about, if you have passion controlling reason, because passion is less than reason. It is supposed to listen. And if it's doing this to reason and reason is not controlling the soul, this is an insult to reason, and it is lowering reason to this, as we were saying last week, like slavish position of like less than what it's capable and should be doing. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think that's consistent with what we've been discussing previously. And if you take the parts of the self and like not think of them as individual but two parts of one whole, it's much easier to think about how the outcome of the power imbalance between those two parts maybe humiliates the whole individual rather than how the parts are humiliating each other. Because I think that, desire, it's often when desire has too much control in our lives that we are humiliating ourselves as a whole individual.
Because the whole individual is this very specific kind of animal? Like, is that the idea?
Yeah, and so as Kant would say, if you are treating yourself as a mere animal and chasing impulses and not using yourself to the fullest extent of your powers given to you as this special kind of creature with two parts, then that, I think, is what he would consider humiliation, to not be reaching your full potential because you're seeking all of these very impulsive and animalistic desires.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, philosophers have disagreed that there is this, like, special part in the human being. Maybe you want to call them something like philosophers of pessimism. But in any case, we said last week that we do have this experience of conflict. And here's another claim that Kant makes that gets to this point about, okay, you're humiliating the whole being because there's this special part that you need to bring to life. Kant talks about the so-called inner judge, that everybody has an inner judge within them. And this thing is always watching, and it's sort of your job to cultivate your being so that you're more harmonizing with the dictates of the inner judge. Did you want to say anything about this idea of the inner judge?
I think it's very interesting, and it's like something to like personally reflect on, and how, because every time you make a decision, there's that little voice in your head, and I think that is what that inner judge is. People call it several different things, but it seems to be this strangely unbiased part of your individual self, and it's like maybe the only part of you that isn't bound by biases trying to protect you from the reality of yourself. And it has the capability to call you out when you are either violating your own expectations of how you should behave or something like that. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm just going to read a couple of sentences where Kant is talking about this inner judge. And this is on the so-called duties to oneself, which is linked on our show resources page. I think it's around section 440-ish. But every man has a conscience and finds himself observed, threatened, and, in general, kept in awe by an internal judge. And this authority watching over the law in him is not something that he himself makes, but something incorporated in his being. So this is the kind of animal that we are. It follows him like his shadow when he plans to escape. He can indeed stun himself or put himself to sleep by pleasures and distractions, but he cannot help coming to himself or waking up from time to time. And when he does, he hears at once its fearful voice. Wow. He can at most, in extreme depravity, bring himself to heed it no longer, but he still cannot help hearing it. So in this passage, he's saying, yeah, you can distract yourself and put it to sleep to some extent, but it's always there. At most, in extreme depravity, a man can bring himself to heed it no longer, but he still cannot help hearing it. Any comments on that one?
Yeah, I think that's so it's so deep, and it's true, because you can listen, or like, okay, so not even listen, but you can obey it, or you can disobey it, but you always have to hear it. There's nothing you can truly do to get away from it. You can run from it, but you'll never actually get away. And
so and so your claim before about you're like humiliating the whole self. You're not humiliating parts of yourself, if you fail to, acknowledge or recognize there's this like inner judge in you that you can't help but hearing. So best if you, work on developing yourself so that your actions are more harmonious with its dictates, something like this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this judge, whatever you want to call it, it wants you to do the best thing for your whole self and most likely for your community and for the world. And it's only going to condemn you when you've done something wrong, not something that's out of line with your desires or not something that's out of line with your reason, just something that is out of line. And so it's not protecting these individual parts because, as any parent of two children knows, you can't force them to agree, and you can't protect one without harming the other. In that if they have very different viewpoints, you can't agree with those. And so the judge cannot protect the interests of both parts against the other all the time. And so it has to protect the individual because that is what makes up those two parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a passage, it's in the work on religion that I mentioned earlier, where he says something like, he uses the phrase inclinations to describe these impulses of the homo phenomenon. And he says something like, you can't, like, to reproach that, like they're part of this homo phenomenon. It's like part of our nature, just like the inner judge is part of our nature. They're both parts of our nature. And it makes no sense to try to get rid of these inclinations. And what you need to be working on is harmonizing the inclinations with the dictates of the inner judge type of thing. So it's a similar point. And that's all. Anything else on this bit?
No, I think you're 100% right.
So, again, feel free to call in with a comment or a question, 516-387-1449. And so at the very least, there is this issue that we have where we're a kind of creature that has this thing that's always watching, that, as you said, is concerned with the well-being of the whole animal, the whole creature. And to not recognize that is to humiliate oneself. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. We do have a caller, so let me take this because we're about to transition, but it may be natural to take the call. Okay, caller, are you there?
Hi, Hope.
Hi. Where are you calling
This is Mark
from?
Shelton.
Oh,
this
hi,
is Mark Shelton.
Dr. Shelton. Excellent. Thank you for calling. Please edify us. And I just want to say Dr. Shelton is an expert on Kant's philosophy, and we are honored to have him contribute to this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I was just listening to the passage from Kant about conscience, and I can't resist introducing someone else.
Oh, boy.
Someone not often thought of as friendly to Kant, but I think that there are ways in which they're friendlier than he supposes even himself. But the passage on conscience just made me think of one of my favorite passages from Nietzsche that is also about conscience. But the main reason I wanted to introduce it is that, with the theme of self-humiliation that you've been describing, I think that Nietzsche has an interesting point about this. So this is from The Gay Science, a passage that is curiously titled Long Live Physics. But he starts talking about the conscience and then asks, what is it that impels me to listen to it? And then he offers a number of things. He says, you can listen to its commands like a good soldier who hears his officer's command, or like a woman who loves the man who commands, or like a flatterer and coward who is afraid of the commander, or like a dunderhead who obeys because no objection occurs to him. In short, there are 100 ways in which you can listen to your conscience. And what I like so much about the passage is the point that he's making, totally compatible with Kant's point that the conscience is there. You can try to shut it up or ignore it, but it's still there and returns. But Nietzsche's making the added point that there are different ways of listening to it. And especially like when he mentions being cowardly in the way that you listen to your conscience, there's a sense in which I don't think Nietzsche's wrong to suggest that you can humiliate yourself by thinking wrongly about that voice.
So, and thinking wrongly about that voice would that be simply not recognizing that there are a number of different ways of listening? What would thinking wrongly about that voice look like?
That is something I've always wished that Nietzsche would have offered more. I like the point, and then I think it's something that we really have to think about. But, I guess one of the ways that I think Nietzsche and Kant are compatible is that among duties to self, one of them that's most important to Kant is the duty against servility. And I think that there are ways that people will interpret their moral conscience that really can turn them into being servants or slaves as opposed to, a well-constituted self. And so, in acknowledging that one has duties to oneself and that moral conscience is an essential part of that, I think even in taking Nietzsche's point but then going back to Kant to try to understand Kant, I think that in talking about servility, Kant is recognizing that there are different ways of doing this, and one does owe it to oneself to have the right conception of how to be a moral person.
Great. We have another caller here, so they've been on hold for a while, so let me get them into the conversation. Okay, caller calling from area code 313. Are you there?
Yes. Hello, Professor Holt.
Oh, hello. And where are you calling from?
I'm calling from the Detroit metro area.
Okay, this sounds like Michael Buzzy.
Yes, it is.
Okay, did you have a point, follow up on something that Dr. Shelton said or anything else?
Yeah, I was really curious about, now given I definitely need to go back and listen to the first part about the discussion of self-humiliation, but just in having listened to the half hour or so of this discussion, you both got into a really good discussion of this inner judge, and I found it too incredibly intriguing. So I was just curious, does this inner judge sort of rise above the effects of humiliation? Like, does one's interpretation of this sort of like inner voice, if it always like errs on the side of towards like moral correctness, sort of, does like that interpretation and then one's own individual fear of humiliation like cause distortions that would then lead individuals to sort of like act wrongly?
Okay, Dr. Shelton, do you want to address that one?
Well, I'm not sure that this is an adequate answer, but what popped into my head just in listening to the comment and question is the case of Nora in A Doll's House, Ibsen's play, where, one of the easiest ways to work with her example is, to take the conventional morality of the time, but of course Ibsen is observing how the conventional morality of the time is suppressing women, suppressing Nora, and so forth. And there seems to be something important about how to understand Nora's assertion of her autonomy, that there really is both a terribly individual point that she needs to stand on, but at the same time, the individual point that she's trying to stand on is universal. You know, she does need to stand against the way in which that conventional morality would be putting her and putting women generally down. And so there's both an individual and a universal assertion in what she does in leaving her husband. And you know, if she just bowed to the conventional morality, which part of her conscience has to be listening to that conventional morality, she would be humiliating herself or continuing to.
Okay. And so, Michael, are you also asking about whether one can humiliate the inner judge?
Yes, that was another question. Is this inner judge, is it above this? Like, I guess in comparison to it, as sort of like trivial conflict of like humiliation between different parts of the self? Isn't it an above observer who witnesses these things, or is it through the interpretation of the individual itself through the lens of humiliation that would then cause the voice coming from this inner judge to be distorted by the individual, I guess leading them to act in sort of very immoral ways? And I just think of the countless dictators and autocrats throughout history, and how they may have then justified to themselves their own actions in, preservation of the self or their power or so forth.
Yeah, these are really deep questions. And I'm just going to say, to go back to where we ended last time, Miranda and I, and the title of this show is The Disease of Self-Humiliation and the Medicine of Self-Knowledge. And Kant identifies a number of duties that we have to ourself, and one of them in particular we have to ourselves as a moral being. And Dr. Shelton, correct me if I get this wrong, because you are the expert on Kant. But this duty of self-knowledge involves two parts. I called it the self-knowledge two-step. And this is the remedy. So my first answer to this concern about dictators deluding themselves and the inner judge being distorted. Number one, the medicine to that is self-knowledge. Number two, self-knowledge involves two steps, and the first one is extremely painful. And in fact, Kant calls it a hellish journey. The first step is removing this evil, he says. There's this evil force in all human beings, and one first in the journey of self-knowledge has to own up to that, as Miranda has said last week, and own up to the truths of oneself, and then work on eradicating that. That doesn't mean, as I said before, getting rid of your inclinations, because Kant says that's impossible. You can't just get rid of your impulses, but you do have to search yourself, and he says the result of that journey of self-knowledge, if done correctly, will result in two things: sincerity and impartiality. So you will look at yourself as equal to all other human beings. So I think about dictators, he would say something like, this person has not done the work, and they are elevating themselves and not seeing other people as beings with equal dignity. I don't know if anybody wants to add on to that, or...
No, I want to endorse that that's correct, because in Kant's political philosophy, the other thing that would provide some clarity about the dictator versus someone who's asserting themselves in an acceptable fashion is that Kant constantly identifies the problem on the political side with unilateralism, being willing to do things unilaterally. It's my way or else. That's the deepest problem in the political sphere on Kant's view. And the corrective to that is the universality, being willing to do things that everyone else can also be willing to do.
Miranda, did you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, so I completely agree, and I think that is a really good way to think of it impartially, is to remove yourself from the equation completely and just say, what would I want the world to do if everybody had to make this decision? And so I think that's such a good framework for that.
And since Dr. Shelton brought in another philosopher, Nietzsche, I feel entitled to bring in another philosopher, and that is Aristotle, who in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he's talking about justice, one of my favorite passages, and it's like in line with this idea of compromise and rejecting the my way or the highway. It's somewhat similar, and he says that equity is higher than justice, and it's a virtue of character. And the equitable man has the law on his side, but he takes less of his share than he's entitled to. So it's the idea of you don't take it all. You actually take less than you're entitled to. And this is a very specific kind of character trait that needs to be cultivated. But Michael, are we answering your concern?
Oh, yes. I greatly appreciate all of your insights. It definitely helped. So allow me to further reflect on what you had been discussing earlier, especially within the context of the questions I had myself. And I definitely feel I have a better grasp of it. So I thank you all for that.
Sure. And my intuition is that, the inner judge cannot be humiliated per se. As Miranda was saying before, you can humiliate your whole self. But yeah, there's this thing, but to properly hear it, you have to remove a lot of the, quote, noise in yourself. So this is step one of the self-knowledge 2-step, is removing the evil. And Miranda, since you spoke about this last week, did you want to again remind us what we said about that? How do you interpret this, removing the evil?
Yeah, so my interpretation is that it's removing the mask or the sort of caricature that you have of yourself, and really looking at yourself in an unbiased, candy-coated way, and really seeing the worth or unworth of yourself and your actions, and really knowing yourself as you are. Because if you don't know yourself as you are right now, how can you move forward and become a better version? Because if you can't own up to your flaws, how can you treat them or correct them?
And this is perhaps part of what makes the journey hellish, because we have to face these uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But this is absolutely essential if we're going to attack that. So anything else, Dr. Shelton, do you want to say anything else about the first step and the self-knowledge 2-step?
It's been well articulated. The part of me is always curious about the extent to which I think that Kant may be taking himself to be responding essentially to Hume, in that, Hume's infamous claim in the treatise that reason is and ought only to be a slave of the passions. And Kant is really quite definitively flipping that on its head. That is, in Kant's view, the evil that is in ourselves, our tendency to simply want whatever we want and use reason to serve it And Kant thinks that it needs to be the other way around, that we need to be prepared to listen to reason. It doesn't always say we can't have what we want, but sometimes it does, and we have to be willing to listen to that. And the evil in ourselves is our attempt to refuse to listen to the voice that will sometimes say, sorry, you can't have that one, you can't do that one.
Yeah. This, as you said, the evil in ourselves is this refusal to listen. I just think that's very well stated. And I think we've said before last week, it's like listening to this part of ourselves. And that really relates to dignity, because when you're violating someone's dignity, you're not listening to them. You're annihilating them. You're not recognizing them. And so I think this idea of listening or recognizing, and that means, giving something your full attention. It doesn't mean, texting when someone's talking to you. This is why we feel insulted. So similarly, to listen to the voice of reason, I think Riley said this last week, it requires, just like you have to sit with yourself and you have to be quiet, and it's painful to do that sometimes. Hence, the journey into self-knowledge is hellish. The second step in the self-knowledge two-step is to develop an inalienable and inherent disposition of a good will. So first is this, like, you remove the evil will, and then you develop a good will. Dr. Shelton, do you want to say anything about that?
Oh, these are the rocks on which almost everyone founders, because Kant says so many things, but then it's also, and how are we supposed to take that? I still think that the best way to handle that concept in Kant is to do so in a way that's rather formal and rather minimal. It's somewhat akin to Aristotle and the way that he handles the concept of virtue. Virtue is simply whatever's best. If it's not best, then it's not virtue. And in a way, what you want to do with Kant's notion of goodwill is you have to be willing to do what's right. If it's the right thing, then go ahead. If it's not, then don't. But it's wide open what the right thing might be heading into what you have to think through. But coming out of what you have to think through, you can't let yourself go. You can't let yourself backtrack. You figured out what was right to the best that you can judge, and now is not the time to let yourself off the hook.
Right, and that has nothing to do with the consequences. Right.
It's always hard to tell. Consequences are, of course, going to figure into your thinking through what is and isn't the right thing to do. But the on Kant's view, the consequences don't determine what's right as opposed to what's not. But I think that what he thinks is our tendency to slip up. This is human frailty that I think Kant thinks is most common, is we do think it through, we do judge what's right, and then we realize that that's going to have consequences we wish it didn't have, and that's when we decide, maybe I got that wrong. And we give ourselves an excuse. But that's always the problem, because we're fallible. So it could be that you didn't judge well, but it could also be that you judged just perfectly fine, but you don't really want to have to carry through. And the self-knowledge is going to be being able to discern in yourself which you're doing.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on this much? Going once, twice? This fallibility point, we have like 10 minutes left, and I wanted to get in something that we did mention in the beginning of the show, which is a concept that you find in Evelin Lindner about unintentional humiliation. And I think this relates to what you're talking about, Dr. Shelton. I'm just going to read a quote. This is in her book called Making Enemies, and there's a link to it on the show resources page, and this quote is on page 72 of that book. Humiliation enters the scene through the self-righteousness that results from biases. Each party feels that it is entitled to help the other party understand right and wrong, producing unintended humiliating effects. This kind of humiliation flows from misunderstanding oneself, the other, and reality, rooted in the common human tendency to see oneself in a more forgiving light than the other. And so it's very interesting, this concept of unintentional humiliation that flows from a misunderstanding of oneself, the other, and reality. Since, Miranda, you have looked at this passage, you want to comment on this passage?
Yeah, I think it so clearly states what we've been trying to get to, which is, A, that unintentional humiliation is possible. I know that was a question we had early on in our research of this topic. And also, in our comparison of A to B humiliation and A to A humiliation, how does perception play a role in our understanding of the humiliation process? And I think this passage illustrates why it's so easy to see the other person as a humiliator and to feel victimized when it's coming from someone else, but harder to say, oh, yes, I've humiliated myself, because to admit that is to admit that you have done something wrong, and something wrong to yourself at that. And so I think that's very interesting, that how much our perceptions can really determine how we define a event.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Shelton, do you want to comment on that comment?
Oh, I don't have anything I would add. I think that that's very well conceived and said.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, in Kantian terms, you would say that this is a mistaken judgment. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, I think so. It does call to mind, for me, another passage, one of my favorites from Kant, where he says that most people are concerned with other people's virtue and their own happiness, when we ought to be concerned with other people's happiness and our own virtue.
Wow, that's good.
Yes.
Yeah,
so,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so when you consider what's happening there with those pairs of things, the prioritization of them needing to be flipped around, I think this is one of the things that's fundamental to what Kant is thinking about, that process of self-knowledge and figuring ourselves out and figuring out what we need to do to make sure that we get our priorities in that correct order, as opposed to the other one, which is obviously easier, more common, more natural, and the other one requires work.
Yeah. And this quote that I read from Evelin Lindner, I'll read the first sentence again. Humiliation enters the scene through the self-righteousness that results from biases. And it seems to me that a part of this work that you're talking about, the work that we have to do, is to become conscious of our biases, that these biases do exist, and maybe that consciousness, that awareness, acts as a sort of counterweight to this tendency that you're talking about, that we have it upside down. I also want to mention, insofar as we have to be aware of our own role or our own responsibility or our own shortcoming, that is not only, I mean, I would say that's hard because there's a bias that has to do with memory and facing difficult truths about ourselves or looking at painful memories. And this is called fading affect bias. And this is the tendency for us to forget negative memories. And that could be negative memories of ourselves doing bad things and so forth. And I think this part of this work is becoming aware of these biases and considering them as playing roles in our judgments at the very least. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Miranda, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I think that's so true. And it really is about these biases and how we see ourselves. And this forgiving light, it's so true. We have this tendency to see ourselves and our own actions in terms of the situation and the context. So if we were running late, it was because traffic was bad or because of some other context outside of ourselves. But if someone else is late, they don't care about their job, they're a late person, that's their character. And so to sort of flip that and give each other the benefit of the doubt and also not always let ourselves say, oh, yeah, that was the situation. Because sometimes it is, but sometimes it really is our character. And if we always allow ourselves to pass the blame, we'll never be able to have this self-knowledge that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well said. I'm at a loss. Dr. Shelton.
Well, I mean, I suppose the only other, I mean, this brings me back to what I like about the passage from Nietzsche is Nietzsche does notice that we can go too far in that the other thing someone can do is they can treat themselves as guilty over everything. And that even when it was unexpected traffic tie-ups that made you late, you blame yourself and say, well, if I had just left 5 minutes sooner, I still would have been on time. And that can be taken too far as well. And so he is right that there are some ways that we can take this aspect, this dual aspect of ourselves and it does go back to that possibility that even in relation to one's own conscience, depending on how one's listening to it, it isn't impossible for you to humiliate yourself.
Can you say that again? About self-humiliation?
I mean, I guess I'm inclined to think that it is a form of self-humiliation if you blame yourself for things that it would be much more reasonable not to blame yourself for. You really did do things in a perfectly reasonable way. You really did leave on time and so forth. It really was traffic that you couldn't have expected. But there are people that blame themselves and think that they should have left even earlier and these kinds of things. And I think that Nietzsche's right to observe that that's unwarranted. It's unwarranted to shrug everything off as if it doesn't matter, but it's also unwarranted to, for lack of a better metaphor, beat yourself up over everything.
Yeah. And we have 90 seconds left, and I just want to, again, complement this discussion with Aristotle, because Aristotle also talks about proper and improper, like there's proper pride, but someone could not have enough pride. They fail to sort of claim the things that they are entitled to. And I think this relates to what you were saying, that I'm entitled to letting myself go on this because I did everything I could do. And there also seems to be, in terms of an Aristotelian analysis, a failure of pride here or self-regard. We have no time left, and I think that we have, wrapped up this discussion about self-humiliation very nicely. Thank you for listening to Ethics Talk. There will be a special show on Monday, which is Peace Day, the anniversary of the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, Miranda Dover, and thank you, Dr. Shelton. I want to say goodbye?
Bye.
And you've been listening to Ethics Talk, and I'm just going to close out with some music. And thank you very much, and have a great weekend.